All right, getting to it with part 2 of the just war, and it's going to be very, very basic to start off with. I just want to go through this list, which may be blocked here. So let me move this over so you can see it. But at any rate, attributes of a just war. We have here 8 of them, and I get this list from 2 places. One, Wayne Grudem's Politics, which he just got this particular section from the ESV Study Bible. I'm not sure whether or not he was the contributor to that section or not, but different people might have different lists, but I figured we'd list them off here. The attributes of the just war, let me just give you the list first, and then we'll talk about some overlap and what these things are. Number 1, just cause. Number 2, competent authority. That's what I mean by duly constituted authority, if you've heard me use that expression. Number 3, comparative justice. 4, right intention. 5, last resort. 6, probability of success. 7, proportionality of projected results. And 8, right spirit. And of course, I'm aware of some of the issues that might come up for each of those. Some overlap, some question begging, etc. So first, some of these might seem to overlap. Okay, for example, right intention and right spirit. Right intention and rights, isn't that just redundant? Others might seem debatable. For example, probability of success. We'll talk about that. Others might seem true enough, but more like tautology, more like just question begging. And of course, that first one might raise eyebrows there. Just war? I just mean just cause. Well, that might seem like that's question begging. So some qualifications are in order. Let me explain what these mean and do not mean. First, the difference between 4 and 8, right intention and right spirit. The difference is in the goal that is being obtained. In other words, are you disarming an aggressor or are you seizing a natural resource? You see that? Disarming an aggressor, which would be just, or are you just seizing a natural resource? Okay? That's number 4, and that's what's meant by right intent. Right spirit, what do we mean by that? In a sense, it's more subjective, but it's still real. The spirit or the feeling that permeates those involved. What's your motive? And there we don't just mean goal obtained. Is it sort of a reluctant resolve that things have come to this and you regret that? Or is it some delight you take in fighting? So, for example, the way that World War I is talked about in the nations of Europe. Second, you might think, well, this appeal right here to probability of success, isn't that just pragmatism? You know, I'll get into this war if we can, pull it off. Isn't that just pragmatism? Well, no, it's not. It acknowledges that some wars must be fought, whether one can win or not, because the alternatives would be morally unthinkable. And so it recognizes that, but it's saying something a little bit deeper. Here, victory in either a whole war or some theater of that war, some battle within it, may be sacrificed for a more realistic peace. Now, that would be the case for a whole conflict, for a more realistic peace. Or you might just do this. So in other words, a just battle. So there could be just battles within wars, or just theaters within just wars, or an unjust war for all that matters, okay? You could sacrifice a particular battle, a particular theater in a whole conflict for a more realistic peace. Or a more, some people would say you should have done that with the bomb, with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Or there's countless examples, which we won't be able to get into too many examples. But the idea here is that more lives can be saved by sacrificing some temporary greater victory for what is the more realistic gain. And sometimes that could be the actual greater victory. So no, it's not pragmatism, but you are using pragmatic reasoning to get the best possible outcome. And if you're not doing that, well, then you're just throwing bodies out in the battlefield, and that's not just right there. So hopefully a little bit more sophistication there, you can see what that means. The third problem you could have with this is we talked about just war, just cause. Isn't that just circular? Isn't that just question begging? Well, we might say that the question finds its answer in the divinely appointed purposes of government. So what's a just cause? Well, Genesis 9, 5, and 6, Romans 13, 1 through 5, the just use of the sword. The just use of the sword surely includes the protection of one's own citizens from an external violence, every bit as much as from the violence within your nation's borders. So we kind of talked about that last time with aggressors and protectors. So that just follows from the legitimate use of government. Okay? Let's talk about a little bit of scriptural data for this. First, Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 1 through 20, Israel's laws concerning warfare, which are very unique in the theocratic history. We've talked about that. The holy wars, there's a unique thing that happened there in history. On the other hand, the fact that there's rules for war, and when you see what they are, is talking about just war. There's a division between a just warfare and an unjust warfare. So the Bible makes that distinction. In Amos chapter 1, in that prophetic book, at the very beginning, all those woes being pronounced on the nations, if you'll notice, are charged partly for what we would today call war crimes. So Gaza, for example, in verse 6, because they carried into exile a whole people to deliver them up to Edom. So the whole people, remember non-combatants versus combatants? Tyre, in verse 9, they did not remember the covenant of brotherhood, so breaking treaties. There's an issue there. The Edomites, in verse 11, because he pursued his brother with the sword and cast off all pity. So you have that right spirit right there. The Ammonites, in verse 13, because they have ripped open pregnant women in Gilead, that they might enlarge their border. And so there you have wrong intention leading to wrong spirit, and then what we would call war crimes. Okay? So you see that? And then we talked about Jesus last time giving a principle, which was a natural law principle of the divided house. Well, here in Luke 14:31, there's another principle assumed here, and it speaks of military strategy being a way of the world. He says, or what king, going out to encounter another king in war, will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000. When Jesus says, what king? It's rhetorical. He means any king would not do that. Any king calculates. In other words, a good king, an ideal king, calculates for the sake of a just war things like his probability of success. He didn't use all those words, but it's clearly what he's saying. Case studies in history are usually what you do at a time like this to just put some cement on this and, bring it down to the bottom shelf. Problem is, when you have a post-civilized culture in which we can't agree anymore on what is a just cause and so forth, you can't necessarily use these as an examples because they will be less and less exemplary of the situation because our vision is so unclear. World War II, for example, was always considered to be an easy one, but increasingly not so much. Now, I did mention last time from Murray Rothbard's quote that World War II actually would not, from the American perspective, rise to that level in his perspective. And he has the non-aggression principle, all that stuff's going on, which we could talk about. But let's leave that off the table for just a second, and let's just look at Britain's part. Okay, so the answering that the Allied powers, and here we're just talking about Churchill and the British Army, or in this case their Air Force, that they've had to do in recent years over the bombing of Dresden, firebombing the German city. Or, analogous situation, even though I said we weren't going to talk about it, Truman's dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The amount of people that have a different view of that now is expanding, and not for libertarian reasons, but for other reasons. Okay? Because you have a generation that is increasingly unsure that the Holocaust ever happened or what the Third Reich actually was. So the reasons there are different than Rothbard's reasons. And again, I'm not going to get into either of those debates with World War II. And somebody can make the argument against Rothbard, for example, what we found out that the Nazis had drawn up whole maps of the United States and what quadrants different members of the Reich would rule, kind of like that fictional series, The Man in the High Castle, except it was with the whole United States. They had those plans, and so you get they had those plans, but they didn't, so how a libertarian thinks through that is another story for another day. But that's one argument you could offer. I'll get off of that. The Revolutionary War, the war for American independence, and you see this in the whole Romans 13. We've already answered that. Edmund Burke, for example, just as if you want some other standard, Edmund Burke is arguing in the British Parliament against the Crown's policy to leave the Americans as they anciently stood, and basing that on common law and their British rights, which is what the colonists did. By the way, 14 years after the beginning of the so-called Intolerable Acts. You say, how intolerable was that? We're talking about tea. Really? That's what you learned in school? Well, no. There were the stamps that were affixed on even religious literature. And so this is the way tyranny works. And if you're not into that sort of thing, it's like, what do I care? We're not being oppressed that much. That's exactly how tyrants do it. They do it incrementally. They pick things which they know that Lenin's useful idiots, and that's his phrase, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, but people that are manipulated and easy to, they just don't learn this stuff, don't think about it. They're not as masculine as those who think about these things, who are charged to be shepherds and leaders and protectors of people. Those people will look at things in isolation. And Marxists know that. Tyrants know that. They know that you have this tunnel vision that's just looking at a stamp. Tunnel vision that's just looking at tea. You don't see what they're stringing together with those pearls, that they're including in that religion and quartering the British system and suspending duly constituted assemblies, as New York's assembly was, and it was suspended by the Crown. There were basic rights hinging on life, liberty, and property that the British Crown was taking away for over a decade, and they addressed those through lawful means. So anybody tells you that the American colonists were just, for no particular reason, just because of pride, just because of modern individualism and stuff like that, they just have no idea what they're talking about. I mean, I don't know how else more plainly to say it. They just have no idea what they're talking about. The American Revolution was, as Russell Kirk and others have argued very well, a conservative revolution. It's doubtful that it ought to be called a revolution. It's just a war, a defensive war for independence, which we'll come back to. Similar, and Rothbard mentioned the U.S. Civil War. And I mentioned in passing, and I kept everybody in suspense, and it wasn't my purpose anyway, that there's always a mixed bag. People say this, you got to pick a side. Who was right? I'm like, no, you don't. You have to be a historian and apply the Ninth Commandment to history. You ever think about that for a second? What do I mean by applying the Ninth Commandment to history? Well, you shall not bear false witness, even if your neighbor is Robert E. Lee. Okay? Here's the truth. There were virtues being upheld that are real virtues, and scoundrels on both sides. The more you delve into the history of the Civil War, the more you realize, what I'm coming up here is a real right to secession and real unconstitutional schemes on the part of Lincoln and actual racism on the part of various Southern leaders. You say, well, X percent of them, 90% and more, did not own slaves, and they really were defending their homeland. That's true. And it's also true that the constitutions of some of those states were expressly founded on the inferiority of blacks. You can't just sweep that under the rug. Conversely, in the North, the Emancipation Proclamation, in the same months that Lincoln finally did allow and follow Frederick Douglass's advice, which he did not for a while, to allow blacks to enlist and to fight for the Union cause, which they had more interest in than anybody else did. Lincoln did not go along with that, partly because of his own racism. And we see that. He said, if I can keep the Union together without freeing a single slave, I would do it. Okay? Furthermore, the Republican Party, the Prager University and all these different, this narrative of, the parties, everybody's wrong about this, by the way. It's like the parties have changed. That will be the counter to this. The Republicans freed the slaves. I haven't seen the Democrats so angry about this since the last time we freed their slaves. There's a truth in that, But there's also a truth in the idea that the parties have switched and flipped and all these different things. We can't unravel all of that right now. But I would say about the Union cause is Marx and Engels wrote a book about the United States Civil War. They wrote columns for this newspaper in New York where they had planted their fellow communists. Charles Dana, who was the leader of the War Department for Abraham Lincoln, was a communist. Most of his fighters, especially in Missouri, were. They were called 48ers. They came over from the 1848 Revolution from Germany. They got kicked out of Europe when that didn't work out for original communism. It wasn't really Marxism because Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto the same year that revolution was going on. By the way, the German Communist Party platform used the language that Joseph Bellamy, eventually a socialist, who wrote our Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. And the line that says, "One nation, indivisible." Do you know that that phrase is word for word lifted from the Communist Party platform in Germany? I'm just saying. You say, oh, what does one have to do with the other? Bismarck was looked at as the Lincoln of Germany. There was no Germany before that. There was just independent states. It was a confederacy. Now, they wouldn't have called it that. Protectorates and so forth. And the Swiss had that as well with cantons. But Bismarck was seen as a Lincoln-like character. He did the same thing. The early nationalist movements in the early 19th century were very much revolutionary and communistic. This is before Marx, even. So we're going to have some stuff to say about nationalism and socialism, both being violent forms of collectivism. Whether you want to call them the left and the right, we'll talk about the political spectrum. Here's my point. There's a real abolition movement in the North. They really did believe in what they were doing. And it was hijacked by communists. William Lloyd Garrison was a communist. And so I hate to disappoint everybody, but no, I don't have to pick a side because real history is much more complex than that. And I just have bad news for all of you. So if you need the whole side of everything to be pure as the wind-driven snow, then history may not be for you. You may just want to be a rabble-rouser, but don't do that. So that's a mixed bag. Now, I do think the U.S. Civil War is, or the War of Northern Aggression, if you want to call it that. Because whether you're talking about the Revolutionary War or the Civil War, I don't think anybody would disagree that secession was on the table. Oh, that's a lost cause thesis, or oh, it's this. Sure. But they believed that, whether you think they had a right to do it or not. Okay? Lincoln actually did. But he was smoother because he couldn't just get away with the ignorance of the people afterwards that followed in his footsteps. He knew that secession was legal, which is why he said, yes, it's legal, if you can win. In other words, if you win, whoever wins gets to decide what's right. Okay? Which is why Jefferson Davis didn't get a trial after the Civil War, because if he was found to be legally in the right about that, then the North would have to admit that they just fought an illegal war when some 8 or more other countries in the 50 years before that across the world had freed their slaves without firing a bullet by simply offering compensation. And of course the South will make, the lost cause argument will make that point. And what I would want to know as a historian, sorry, I'm going on a tangent here, is were there records of these conversations happening in Congress? Were there overtures passed by Southern legislatures? Those are the kind of questions I would want to ask next in digging into that a little bit more. But we're not going to get into that now. I bring it up because of the idea of union and disunion. While we're talking about wars, do you remember last time, what did I do? Not bring the markers over here? Genius. Remember last time I talked about foreign and domestic, and by the way, that's what these F's and D's stand for. Okay? There's 2 kinds of aggressors. Maybe I don't need to get the marker because I already put it up here. And these just represent, I didn't draw America because this is not to scale anyway. But if I did, you get the idea. 1938, obviously, I'm talking about the beginning of Germany going out there. 1775-ish, 74, whatever. The Royal Fleet goes that way. So you understand what those 2 represent. World War II, War for American Independence. The D's and the F's, though, stand for, that's over here. Domestic and foreign. And remember, from that week we talked about the line of legitimacy. Criteria for tyranny is the criteria for a state breaking down. And now they're a foreign aggressor. Okay? They're not the same thing as a state. Just because some lunatic puts on a Burger King crown and waves a sword around in the village square, that does a, yeah, but he's got the same uniform on. He's got a blue shirt on. No, it's his shiny badge. You get it in a Cracker Jack box. Yeah, but it's got the right symbol on there. See, you could do that all day long, and it's not going to work. Okay? Legitimate, at the end of the day, you're going to have to come up with some abstract principle. Okay? So, anyway, sorry. So, here you have a clear foreign state, namely Nazi Germany, coming into clearly a different foreign state, France and or Poland, going across Belgium. We're not going to get into the whole history. You get the idea, though. Foreign versus foreign. Simple enough. 1775, it's domestic and domestic, right? Because they're part of the British Empire. But if you listen to Edmund Burke, not just the American colonists, if you actually know the history of it, you understand that the line of legitimacy was crossed. And that's Jefferson's point. And you ever notice how the people that always say the American Revolution was sinful and all that business, they never interact with the material? And I'm not even asking you to interact with these obscure legislative debates in the colonies or Edmund Burke's speeches or anything else. Let's just start simple. Let's start with the Declaration of Independence. They never do that because then they'd have to argue against inalienable rights coming from God. Now they can dismiss that too. That was a deist that wrote that, and we've been through that. Okay? So what's happening here is not a real argument. You understand? There's no real argument happening. There's dismissal, there's cheap shots, there's fallacies everywhere. Ad hominem attacks, they won't deal with the actual record. This same thing applies to coups. Now there's ordinary military coups that even the United States could be guilty of if you're guilty of them, and let's just assume they are. The U.S. with Iraq. Okay, we had to do X, but then we have to do Y. Again, we would be here for 30 weeks debating all that stuff, and so that's not what I'm getting at. At this point, I'm just saying that's what a coup is. A government goes in, sets up a puppet government. Sometimes they have to do that by force. They can do it in an overnight revolution. They can assassinate a leader. They can do any number of things. There's a second kind of coup called a color revolution. And this is the favored form of regime change model that was used in Eastern European countries. And it's not just the Eastern European countries. What you do is a couple of things. Number one is you engineer contested elections by dragging it out and maximizing disinformation as you drag it out. You see that on the news all over the place your whole childhood, but you don't think about it because that's what happens in those Cracker Jack, banana republics and stuff. They're not legitimate. Oh, here they are again, armed guards guarding the ballot and stuff. And you're just used to it, okay? But what's happening is somebody from outside dragged that out and maximized disinformation on behalf of some leader. Now, if he's already in there, like Putin or whoever else, he can do that from within. But in those weaker countries, it's usually happening from without. Now, once you do that and you have all this misinformation and nobody can trust the process, you combine that with mass protests that can fly as peaceful civil disobedience. And we're all about that because we all have First Amendment rights. So they have that right as long as, I'll just stand here just in case I'll wait until they cross that line, but they never do. Because they're peaceful, you got to make sure that you're all on your best behavior. But if you use as much agitation and as much violence as you could possibly get away with, you can make some more fire, you can instill more fear, you could even directly threaten people, because you can't really get away with that at the polling booth itself with the armed guard, but perhaps you can do that on the path. And with the help of naive executives, governors, local people, and naive populations, this kind of a revolution can then use the conservative police to run interference for them. Because, of course, they just are doing their job and they want to keep peace, and you've agreed to keep peace. And the people that really know what's going on are going to hit back, and they're going to be the aggressors. The protectors actually turn to the aggressors. And police, I'm not saying anything against police, but typically police and military don't get their jobs because they're moral philosophers beforehand, nor are they pursuing those jobs so that they can become moral philosophers. They're 18-year-olds. They want a paycheck. They want the GI Bill, whatever it is. They will follow orders. Oh, the conservatives are red. They're red, white, and blue. They're the 80% of the military, yada, yada, yada. They will follow orders. They got into this at age 18 for the GI Bill or to see the world or whatever it is. They will follow orders. Just understand that. And so by running interference for the mob, because Lenin or whoever knows that they just want to keep order, it disables the law-abiding citizens from fighting back. And so again, as I said 2 times ago, use your words, whether president, governor, sheriff, use your words. It is morally reprehensible in a situation like that not to tell your people, we're on your team, here's your police, here's how long they're going to be there, here's what to expect, here's what you can do. None of that. None of that. You see this in Yugoslavia in 2000, Georgia in 2003, that's the other Georgia, not the one in the south, Ukraine in 2004 and 14, Hong Kong. Hong Kong from the summer, remember last year? By the way, you remember right before COVID happened? Brexit happened. Iran was happening. Hong Kong was happening. They were happening right before COVID. There was all sorts of disruptions and the wheels were falling off the bus on the New World Order. There were secession movements everywhere. Can't have that happen. But how did Beijing characterize the pro-democracy protests? They characterized it as a color revolution that was disrupting law and order. You can see this on YouTube. China, the Republic of China has a channel on YouTube, and you can watch that. And if you look at their newscasts, they're using word for word conservative language, law and order, back the blue or red or whatever it is over there, and basically accusing the Hong Kong side and managing everything in such a way as if that was a color revolution. But external forces, color revolution, whatever it is, the principles of just and unjust, of aggressor and protector are all the same. The common thread in unjust wars and coups from external forces is that there is an aggression. There is a use of violent force against individuals, against people groups who have done the revolutionaries no wrong. Why would I bring that up? The revolutionaries don't care, they know that. Sure, but if you're part of the 50% useful idiots, to use Lenin's phrase, who roll out the red carpet for them because you just can't think on this level. You just want peace, sunshine, happiness, free ponies, and rainbows. And so you're just voting for sunshine and social justice. But you need to know that those who are just homeschooling their kids and those who are just having families and starting schools and whatever else, they're not doing anything to you. Why are you bludgeoning them? I'm not bludgeoning. What are you talking about? Again, just pay attention to the principle. I have no hopes of waking you up. But when you do wake up when it's too late, and you have that moment, I don't remember what show that was, but Hogan's Heroes, or what was it that? The guy said, are we the baddies? There's a lot of people in the last 9-10 months that have had their are we the baddies moment where the pennies drop, but it's just too late. There's thousands of people, including in the media, some high profile people who are leaving the Democratic Party and they're understanding too little too late. Oh boy. They're openly saying, CEO of Twitter, we're going to line them up against the wall and shoot them. Obama, Clinton, the highest ranking people in the Democratic Party, not Joey Jojo Shabadoo in the trailer park in Missouri, the highest ranking members of the Democratic Party saying we will not accept the results of the election, and others advocating violence against the other side. Openly. And the media's not calling them on that. You at least have to have, that's got to do something for you. I mean, you don't have to agree with our worldview, but at least say to yourself, wait a minute, I'm not for that. Okay? And so, for some sordid gain, life, liberty, property, and that collective system that people have to protect those are being overthrown and destroyed. That's the common thread. It's a discernible thing. And so we close this session by coming full circle and asking ourselves the question that I opened with in these 4 sessions on force and police and all that stuff. Did the citizens of London have a right? Theoretically, would they have had a right if the Nazis made a land invasion? Would they have had a right to forcibly protect themselves? Again, the British Air Force, in that sense, the British government would have broken down. And of course, you're not Germans, you don't owe yourself to the Nazi government, so they're not your government. You can't Romans 13 them. But your government's broken down, their government's broken down. So would they have had a right to forcibly protect themselves? Would we, in the event of a coup that the so-called red state forces just gave up on, have a right to organize and at least start with your governor, sheriff, and local people and say, wait a minute, have you used your words? Have you said whose side you're on? Oh, we don't take sides. You don't take sides in open bloodshed when they're telling you, hey, we're coming to kill you? You can't take a side on that? Why are you voting for those R's then? They're Nazis. No, they're not Nazis. They're just not going to do anything about the Nazis. Well, then they're Nazi enablers. Very, very simple stuff. Come back next time. We'll start talking about that idea of disunion. Its right, its process, its history, and so forth. Talk about that next time.